Hey class, so in this video I'm going to be giving you an overview on digital cameras. Remember that all digital cameras are different, they have different buttons, they have different menus, they have different ways of doing things, but all digital cameras at heart have the same functions. Those main functions being ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And I'm going to go into most of those main functions that all of your cameras should have. So, before we look at all the different types of digital cameras, I think it's important for us to look at film cameras and how the modern day camera got to where it is today. So when using a film camera like this, all of the functions are manual, meaning that you have to read the scene, you have to determine how much light there is, and you need to set your camera accordingly in order to capture that light. So in order to change the ISO and all the other settings on your camera, you need to be sure to put it into manual mode. Now, on a lot of cameras, there will be a dial up here at the top with letters on it, and there will be a dial marked M for manual mode. So once you get your camera into manual mode, you'll find that there are four main pieces of information that are shown. Those would be the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO, and a meter. So the meter is what you're generally going to use in order to make sure that your exposure is right before you take the picture. So your camera is constantly reading the light that's going on, and it's giving you live feedback onto whether or not the settings that you have line up with the light that the camera is reading. So on a camera's meter that you'll see on the screen or in the viewfinder of your camera, there will normally be a bar going from left to right, and you'll see a center mark, and that will denote when something is properly exposed. If something is moving to the left in negative numbers, that means that it's underexposed and too dark. If something's moving to the right in positive numbers, that means it is overexposed and too bright. And those numbers that you see, -1, -2, +1, +2, those are called stops. What a stop is it is halving or doubling the amount of light getting to the sensor of your camera in an exposure. The term stop is used because there are actually three different ways to change the exposure of your digital or film camera. That would be the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. So the reason to have a singular term like stop is so that the photographer has options to achieve that. If your camera is telling you that you're underexposed by one stop, you can adjust any one of those three things to achieve that proper exposure by increasing by one stop. First, let's talk about ISO. And to understand ISO, we need to talk about film. Film is made with different sensitivities for different purposes, and that sensitivity is denoted by the ISO number. The lower the number, the least sensitive. Somewhere around 50 is really low. And the higher the number, the more sensitive to light it is, somewhere around 3200. Lower ISO film typically has much smaller grain and is able to be a lot sharper and have higher resolution than higher ISO films. But higher ISO films give you the ability to shoot in more difficult and dark situations. So whenever possible, you would want to choose a film with a lower ISO because that means that your images will be a lot sharper and turn out a lot better. Now, how does that compare to digital? On a digital camera, you just have a digital sensor, but the ISO number increases or decreases the sensitivity of that sensor to light. Now, instead of having bigger or smaller grains, you actually end up with a noisier and worse image the higher the ISO you go, and cleaner and smoother images when you lower the ISO. Your colors end up being a lot better, your resolution ends up being much clearer, and your details really pop. So whenever possible, you want to keep your ISO as low as you can. Normally, that's going to be ISO 100. Now sometimes, you can't have your ISO be that low because shutter speed is going to be a problem. So next, let's talk about shutter speed. So inside your camera, there's a mechanism that is keeping your film or sensor away from light only until you want it to be. When you press the shutter button on your camera, a mechanical part will actuate and open up that sensor for a certain amount of time. So shutter speed is normally denoted in fractions of a second. So the number 1/2 is 1/2 of a second. That's a pretty long shutter speed. You're definitely going to get blur. But when you start increasing that number, 1/30, a 30th of a second, you can start to handhold that. 1/60th, 1/125th, 1/1000. Those are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, meaning that the amount of time that your shutter is open to light is incredibly small, and you can capture faster and faster motion. What the bottom line of that means is that if you're hand holding a picture, you always are going to want your shutter speed to be 1/60th, a 60th of a second, or less. So that means a 60th, a 1/25th, a 2/50th, 500th, somewhere in that ballpark. If you start to go below a 60th of a second, you're going to start getting blur in your images and you're just not going to be able to take pictures. So that's one of the ways that you're limited by the shutter speed of your camera. And it's one of the determining factors in your ISO choice. So the third way that you can adjust the exposure of a picture that you take is with the aperture. Built into every lens, it opens and closes, and that lets in more or less light. So you may ask, why does aperture exist? Why would you ever want to close your lens and let less light in? Well, there's a couple reasons. One is to have an alternative way to adjust exposure. Remember that when film cameras were around, you couldn't change the ISO on the fly. You had to stick to one the entire time. And I recommend you to try the same. Try sticking to just one ISO during your whole time shooting. Also, sometimes your shutter speed just may not be able to keep up with the amount of light coming at the camera. Especially on old film cameras, your top shutter speed might be 1/500th of a second. And if you're in a really, really bright situation and maybe you're using a high ISO film, you need to have this secondary option to be able to close down that lens from light so that you can get an adequate shutter speed that you want. So aperture is also divided into fractions just like shutter speed. So the higher the aperture number you go, the less light you're letting in. So generally you want the lowest number possible, 3.5, 4, 1.2, 2.8. These kinds of apertures are wider and let in more light. Closed down apertures are like f8, 11, 16, 22. These will let in less light. So, shooting the camera. Now you're armed with this new information on what aperture and shutter speed and ISO is, you can go out and start taking some pictures in manual mode. You want to make sure you keep an eye on that meter and make sure that you're keeping it right in the middle, ideally. With aperture, you want to make sure that it's as open as it can be, unless you need more sharpness. If you find your images soft, you may want to stop down. Your ISO, you want to keep it as low as you can so that you can have the cleanest images possible to work with. And shutter speed, you want it to be in a reasonable range, generally over 1/60th of a second. You can go up way higher if you have a wide aperture, but like I said, keep that ISO as low as possible. If you're out on a bright day, turn it all the way down to ISO 100. So with those things in mind, set your cameras to manual mode and just go try taking some pictures. Our next few assignments are going to be technical exercises where we're going to make sure that we know how to use all of those functions. And I'm going to be making some supplemental videos and lessons for additional functions that your camera has, like white balance and exposure compensation and all kinds of other functions. So be on the lookout for those. Just start shooting pictures and have a great time. I'll see you guys next time.